Hi, welcome back. It's Anna
and Rose,
coming to you from the Mystery Parlor.
This episode was inspired by a seance that someone close to us attended in the late 1960s. But voila, we can't talk about speaking to the dead without the Ouija board getting some front and center attention.
We are super excited about this episode. It's our spookiest so far. We have a lot to get into today, including an interview we had with a very trustworthy, no-nonsense pillar of the community who Rose has known her entire life. But first, we will share our personal Ouija stories with you.
Would you like to start, Anna?
Sure. I played with the Ouija board once, and once was enough.
Do tell.
Sometime around 1987, a friend Shannon and I decided to give the Ouija board a try. No clue where it came from originally, but I'm pretty sure we found it on the workbench in the laundry room. We were at the house I lived in throughout my teenage years. Quick note about the laundry room. It was narrow, with the exposed understairs on one side and a workbench on the other. There was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling with a pull string and a creepy exposed drain hole on the floor. At the end was a doorway of jagged, missing cement blocks into a dark storage area, which at the time, or one time, was a dry cellar for canned goods.
We need one of those because our canning plans for this upcoming summer.
Yes, we should tell the boys to start digging. So we set up the Ouija board on an antique steamer trunk used as a coffee table in the finished living space in the basement, not the part I just described in the laundry room. It was summer break, and Shannon and I were home alone. My brothers had baseball practice at a nearby park, and my mother was working. One of my daily chores during the summer was to get the coffee pot ready so that when my mother got home, all she would need to do is press the start button. She was an all-day coffee drinker and still is. Maybe it's a sign. She's in her 70s, super active, has never had surgery, not on any medication, and never has been. Just in case you're wondering, she has always drank her coffee black. Yuck. So, about the coffee pot. It was the most basic Mr. Coffee one could buy. Maybe there were coffee pots at the time that could be preset to make at a particular time, but not at our house. Everything was basic. So as a good daughter, the coffee was ready to rock and roll as soon as she got home every single day. This was an old house. Original wood windows, most of which needed propped up with something when open. The floors would creak when anyone walked across them, so you would know when someone was home or moving around. I have no idea what we asked the Ouija board that day, or even if it answered. All I know is when we were playing, the coffee pot began percolating and making the familiar gurgling sound of a fresh pot of coffee being made. Shannon and I bolted, screaming all the way up the stairs from my mother in hopes she came home, and somehow we missed the sound of the door and her footsteps, but nobody was there, leaving us wondering who or what started the coffee. This was the only time the coffee pot turned on by itself. Shannon and I were scared to death. I'm scared to death just thinking about it now. Somehow, we mustered up the courage to go back down and put the game away. We left it the box, the whole game, where we found it on the workbench in the laundry room. But now we buried it, or then we buried it deep under a pile of clothes that my brothers had outgrown. They were for hand-me-downs for someone else. Never again did I feel comfortable in that basement. I would dread doing laundry and use tunnel vision in that dark and narrow laundry room, ignoring the workbench and pretending the storage area at the end didn't even exist. Always feeling like there were eyes on me. I would run extra fast up the basement stairs, sure the gaze of something was chasing me. Even now, the thought of that dank laundry room is frightening. I looked up the house on Zillow today, and the laundry room was the only room in the house not pictured.
Did anything else happen in the house?
Yes. One very, let me think. One very specific thing happened to my mom, and there were a few general things, mostly shortly after the Ouija board incident. We will be sharing those in another episode. Rose, are you ready to share your Ouija board story?
Sure. My friends and I tried to order a Ouija board from Amazon back in high school. We gave the task to a specific friend. We were scared but also excited to try it out. When we opened up the box, we realized that she had ordered a Ouija board themed glass cutting board. It was smaller than we expected and not usable. It didn't have the planchette, it was just the plain glass cutting board. I think we reordered the correct thing though and planned a sleepover for like the next month. And I don't remember much about that night except for the lights flickering, but I'm pretty sure her parents were behind that.
Is that your one and only Ouija story?
My own, yes, but one of my friends refuses to ever use one, and this is why. My friend Emma has a cousin named McKenna who had a very terrifying Ouija experience. McKenna was at her friend's grandma's house with a group of girls. They got out a Ouija board and made contact with something. They asked how the spirit had died, and it answered, glass. Then goodbye and silence. That's it. Later that night, McKenna was getting ready for bed and thought that she saw a shadow in the bathroom. When she went to check, the light went out, the door slammed shut, and the mirror fell from the wall and shattered all over the floor. There was a lot of broken glass.
There is something about mirrors that makes everything even spookier.
I agree. Now, let's drive into... I agree. Now, let's dive into Gail's story. I've known Gail for my whole life. She's in her 80s now, but sharp as ever. Back in the early 1970s, she was renting an upper unit of a house. She had 2 young girls under the age of 5, Rachel and Lisa. Gail was working evenings, and her sister would come and stay to take care of the girls. The couple living downstairs had no children. They were in their mid to late 30s. Bob and Marie. Bob was a coffee drinker and would be a bit bothersome at times. When Gail would make a pot of coffee, Bob would smell it and often invite himself up for a cup with Gail. And he usually stayed way too long.
I had a neighbor like that once. I think we all have.
Gail's sister, Joni, asked Gail one morning if she ever hears footsteps in the attic at night. Gail couldn't recall anything, but Joni insisted that she would hear footsteps after putting the girls to bed. It was the early 70s, and the logical answer was to get the Ouija board out and ask it. Gail and Joni pulled out the Ouija board, but not expecting anything too exciting to happen. Wrong. It was very active. They asked aloud, "Is there someone there walking around at night?" "Yes." "Why are you here?" "Visit the girls." "Rachel and Lisa?" they asked. "Yes." What is your name? Bobby. How old are you, Bobby? 12. Goodbye.
Goodbye? I want to leave. I want to say goodbye, but I want to hear the rest.
Gail and Joni thought it was all in good fun and weren't too freaked out, thinking maybe, just maybe, the other was doing a little leading of the planchette. The next time Bob was up for coffee, Gail mentioned the Ouija incident and how the board said the name of the spirit was a kid named Bobby. Bob perked up real quick. He said, "No worries. That's just my son Bobby. He won't hurt anyone." Come to find out, Bob and Marie had a son named Bobby, who had suffered from a severe case of cerebral palsy. He had passed away a few years before Gail and the girls had moved in. He was only 12 when he died.
Oh my gosh. Rose, my goosebumps have goosebumps. Even after hearing this story several times.
The story is especially interesting to me because Gail has a very strong religious beliefs, and I really trust that she's telling us the truth. This is not something that she would joke about. She was very spooked by this, and she never used a Ouija board ever again. Also, they had no knowledge of the little boy, Bobby, before this happened.
I'm in 100% agreement and don't want to think about anything else it could be. So let's just hope it was 12-year-old Bobby sweetly watching over the girls.
So do you think a Ouija board works, like, for real?
Yes. I think at times the planchette is being guided by something other than a living human playing the game. I would say it's either who it says it is, or someone or something we can't see or explain.
We've watched enough Exorcist movies to know it can open the door for something sinister. So personally, playing with it now is a big no for me too.
Before we move on, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite podcasts right now called The Exorcist Files. It's some of the experiences of Father Carlos Martins, an exorcist of the Catholic Church with almost 2 decades experience. There have also been a few interesting guest speakers. FYI, we just took a break from the podcast to check if there were any new or bonus episodes of the Exorcist Files, and there was one just a few days old. As we were listening, someone who is not famous was mentioned by name that I know personally.
Coincidence or string theory? We've been looking into string theory, and we'll have an episode about that subject very soon.
If Ryan or Father Martins is listening, we wish the episodes were longer and more frequent. Just can't get enough of a good, scary thing.
I suspect Father Martins has some sort of influence on the film Nefarious, which we watched together last year.
Yeah, it was the cleanest exorcism movie ever made, I think. No blasphemies, sex scenes, or 4-letter words, yet it was scary as... insert your choice of a 4-letter word.
What about the exorcism of Emily Rose? Wasn't that pretty clean?
I forgot about that one. Maybe. But it was a sad one for sure.
So, should we talk about the seance now?
Yes. We'll call our main character Bev. Bev grew up in the small town of Ingram, Pennsylvania, and went to Montour High School in McKees Rocks.
Side note, we found out that the actor Michael Keaton went to high school around the same time. We asked Bev and Ginger if they knew him. They remembered him, but they weren't friends. He was in a different grade and a different friend group.
And I had to tell Rose who Michael Keaton is. Bev still has her bestie Ginger from childhood. As a matter of fact, they are on a cruise right now together, sailing the Bahamas, and are probably feasting or gambling as we speak. The Smiths were a family Bev and Ginger went to high school with. The Smiths had two girls, Lorna and Audrey, who we will call the Smith sisters. And they also had two hunky brothers, Gil and Ray.
Hunky? That's how Bev described them, with flushed cheeks and a grin on her face. The Smith family lived in an old brick gambrel-style house with a massive chimney on one side. The house sat up and back from the main road in a row of similar homes. A few Tudor-style homes, maybe a French Revival or craftsmen scattered in, but mostly colonials. The homes could hardly be seen while driving by, with just the rooftops visible from the road. You would need to get out and walk up the long flight of steps to each house. A retention wall was built at the edge of the front lawns along the sidewalk. The homes had a narrow alley behind them that allowed a car to travel and park in the detached garages set far behind the main houses.
Alleys behind houses are almost always scary, even new ones. The Smith family home was well known among the girls at school as the haunted house. It was said the hauntings revolved around the main dining room, where a prominent fireplace was the focal point of the room. It all started when photos were developed of family dinners, mainly big holiday gatherings, in the formal dining room. The gatherings when weather was cold and the fireplace was lit, requiring the flue to be open, there were extra, somewhat transparent people showing up in the photos. These people tended to be clothed in Edwardian-era dress, high necklines for women, and men with ties and bow ties, vests and jackets, not just a double exposure of those physically known to be there, but actual extra people not known by the family. The Smiths family started to experiment by taking pictures at different times of day during different seasons, and therefore with the chimney flue sometimes open, sometimes closed. In the end, it was concluded that something was happening when the chimney flue was open. All of these things took time, different seasons, and 2 weeks to develop the film.
Cameras in the 60s were usually 35mm film that took 2 weeks to have developed. Same day and 1 hour 35mm film developing became available in the 80s. The first digital cameras came out in the 80s. Our cell phone cameras advanced quickly. Sharp was the first with a 0.1 megapixel in 2000, followed by a 2 megapixel integrated into a smartphone in 2005. And finally in 2010, Apple's iPhone 4 had a 5 megapixel with LED flash and the ability to shoot HD video. Everything since then has been the same, just increasingly better.
Thank you, Rose, for the history lesson. I can't believe, 20 years ago, we basically had crap. Meanwhile, rumors about their haunted house inspired the Smith sisters to host a seance. Bev doesn't think it was the first seance the Smiths planned and executed. A group of giggling girls arrived that night. Bev and Ginger, their friends Jane and Sue, along with the hosting Smith sisters, Lorna and Audrey. Mrs. Smith planned to lead the seance.
Bev doesn't know if Mrs. Smith is a clairvoyant, a psychic, telepathic, a medium, but to a teenager, Mrs. Smith seemed familiar with what she was doing. 2 candelabras were arranged on the table and lit. The large, heavy wood pocket doors were pulled closed. A fire was already going in the fireplace. Mrs. Smith was at the head of the long table, directly in front of the roaring blaze, keeping them all warm. There were 3 girls on each side of the table. 7 of them total in the room. 7 living humans, that is.
The chandelier was turned off, and Mrs. Smith began inviting and conjuring any spirits that may be near. I don't know if I would start laughing or crying if I was there. Bev and Ginger said the feeling in the room was intense. The suspense of the unknown was thrilling, but things took a turn quickly because everyone's chairs began shaking. The girls looked to each other to see if the others were experiencing the same thing, even leaning to see behind the chairs, for logic told them someone must be shaking things. Maybe even the Hunky Smith brothers were the culprits. Then they could have all had a good laugh, yet no one else was there. Even the solid table started shifting and moving, making the candles flicker as Mrs. Smith continued reciting what sounded like a monologue to the dead. The girls went from excited to terrified, even fearful.
I probably would have passed out. Suddenly, Jane began screaming, a piercing scream. She was shrieking for it to stop, bawling incoherently about something to do with her legs. One of the Smith sisters who lived there jumped up to turn on the lights and pushed open the pocket doors. Poor Jane was inconsolable. Between her sobs, she told the group how it felt like someone was beating on her legs. Her knees were already red and welty, something that would have been noticeable if they were like that when she arrived at the house earlier that evening. As she pushed down her socks, there were marks on her legs and bruises were beginning to show.
The seance was over. No one wanted to continue. Jane called her parents to come get her. The rest of the girls spent a sleepless night in the house far from the dining room. The Smith sisters, nor Jane and Sue, ever spoke to Bev or Ginger about the night again. They'd all pretend it never happened. But Bev and Ginger have talked about it over the years several times and still describe it as one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives, at least the most unexplained thing that had ever personally happened to either of them.
We found out that the house is still standing and has at least one living occupant. At the most recent class reunion, Bev ran into one of the Smith sisters, who told her that Mrs. Smith is still living, pushing 90 years old, and that her address hasn't changed.
Well, that's one person who's not afraid of the house. I visited the area not too long ago and drove by the house for the first time. Putting my hazard lights and parking brake on, I jumped out of the car and peered over the wall after taking a few steps up on a neighbor's house sidewalk entrance. All I can say is the house has a very dark vibe and the chimney is daunting. Seance, crystal balls, fortune tellers fall into the same category as Ouija boards for me, and it's all a big nope. I'm flat out scared to death to mess with any of it. But at the same time, I love visiting places like Salem, Massachusetts, and New Orleans, listening to spooky podcasts, watching paranormal documentaries, and researching for these episodes, and most of all, hearing other people's stories.
I do not plan on using a Ouija board ever again, but I'm very intrigued by everything paranormal. My friends and I like to watch ghost hunter shows and alien documentaries together. I definitely think there's a lot out there to explore. Ginger hasn't had any other experiences, but Bev had at least one other thing happen to her. Her youngest sister passed away unexpectedly in her early 50s. At the funeral, Bev was a bit unsettled at the sight of her sister in the coffin because her corpse looked angry. The expression on her face was not one of peace or calmness, but that is not the scariest part. She had a graveside service. The weather was very cold and with freezing rain. Bev and her husband were one of the last to leave. The cemetery was empty, not even a work truck in sight. When Bev glanced back a final time, there was a tall, thin man standing at the already covered grave. He was slightly bent in posture and wearing a black cloak with a hood. Bev became frightened and frantic, wondering if anyone else could see him. She quickly asked her husband to look. He indeed saw him as well, or at least he said he did, and tried to ease Bev's mind by saying it must have been a gravedigger inspecting the work, and that the cloak was due to the rain. Bev still feels unsettled just thinking about it.
Bev said she hates to say the words Grim Reaper, but that is exactly what he looked like. Here is another coincidence, or shall we call it string theory? While doing research for this episode, we looked up Bev's sister's obituary to see how old she was and how long it had been since she passed. Well, folks, it has been exactly 1 decade to the day of her sister's death. Yes, we looked up her obituary on the anniversary of her death. She was 52 years old when she died unexpectedly.
And since we are still brand spanking new to this realm of podcasting, if you have a mystical, obscure, paranormal, or an out-of-this-world story we need to share, our email is open. Please send us your experiences at mysteryparlor@gmail.com. We promise to read and respond to each and every one of you.
We have created a page on a website called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can support us by giving us a one-time donation or subscribing to us for exclusive content. Your support will help us with things like upgrading our equipment, planning on-site episodes, arranging for guest speakers, and more frequent episodes. You can find us on Buy Me a Coffee and Instagram using the links in the description. Bye for now.